Welcome everyone to the ISM Rochester Lunch and Learn webinar series. We're so grateful to bring it back for our fall season. I would like to mention that next week, September 22nd, we will be having our first membership meeting for the new program year. It will begin at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. Our guest will be Jane Tierney, who will be speaking on the important topic of what the Ukraine war might mean to your supply chain. Be sure to register for this program. Also, we ask that you please use our Q&A or chat area for any questions you might have for today's speaker. Now on to our exciting program. Our guest today is Stephen Nichols, who is the founder of Banyan Outcomes. At this time, I'd like to turn the program over to Stephen and just ask him to do a little brief background.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, I'm Stephen Nichols. I'm the founder of Banyan Business Outcomes. We're a technology vendor consulting company. So what I do is I help clients form great relationships with technology vendors, specifically services vendors. And one of the areas that I work in is, of course, third-party risk, or the risk that vendors create for people. And kind of excited today to talk through the different types of risk and how to manage risk and some of the technologies that can be applied to the problem. So let me share my screen so we can get that up too. One second. Okay, let me know if that's not coming through. We should be good. So yeah, as Kathy mentioned, or I mentioned a second ago, we'll talk through 6 different types of third-party risk, or different categories of risk that you might face from vendors, or the vendors might create for you. We'll talk through how to score and manage that risk. We'll talk through how to do vendor risk assessments and some of the services and tools related to that, the technologies and that kind of thing. I might also mention that I'm presenting to ISM Dallas next week, same time next week, 10 a.m. to talk through managed security service providers, which is an area that I have a fair amount of experience in. So hopefully you guys can join me for that too. We'll throw the link up. I think Kathy sent it out, and you can, of course, email me too if you'd like. So let's just dive into the content. Let's see. So there's 6 different types of third-party risk, or 6 different categories. The first one is cybersecurity. Then there's regulatory or compliance risk. There's financial risk, operational, reputational, and strategic risk. These are all the different kinds of things that are risks that vendors can create for you. I'm going to walk through each of these with a few different slides. So in terms of cybersecurity risk, these are risks that you might face because your vendor or your partner that you're worked with has had some kind of cybersecurity incident. So a bad actor can work to penetrate or create a breach for a vendor, and then the vendor may expose you to that bad actor by virtue of what they're doing to work with you. So think specifically about vendors that might have privileged credentials on your network, or that might manage some of your data for you. Those are all great sources, or terrible sources maybe, of third-party cybersecurity risk. There's a really good example of this that happened in the wild to Target. I think most people know that there was a breach that Target went through back in, I think, 2014, so a few years ago. They did business with a refrigeration company. So the company managed all of the refrigerators and freezers inside the grocery stores. And this refrigeration company had this interesting tool that sat on Target's network and allowed them to monitor the refrigerators and the freezers and make sure that they're performing well and do preventative maintenance and that kind of thing. So the refrigeration company had a cybersecurity incident, and basically someone was able to break into it and start injecting some code into the refrigeration company's systems. And then the refrigeration company installed that on Target's network. And the bad actors were able to move laterally across Target's network and get access to a few million credit card numbers. And this happened right before the holiday season and created a huge headache and about $1 billion in loss for Target. It was a huge problem for them. They made the news over it. So I think that's a great example of how a third party can expose you to risk. Now, there's a report, it's called the Verizon puts out every year that talks about the state of the union in terms of cybersecurity. And in the report, it says only about 1% of cybersecurity incidents actually come through vendors or partners, but that those incidents have this oversized effect on the world or on the market. So what that basically means is if a bad actor is able to penetrate one vendor, then they're actually, affecting hundreds or dozens or hundreds or thousands of customers. And that actually happened to a company called SolarWinds just a few years ago, maybe 2 years ago, actually. SolarWinds was a very popular network management tool, or network monitoring tool. And a bad actor was able to install software for SolarWinds software, and then that got propagated out to many different customers. And a lot of IT guys had to do late night changes to remove that malware from their systems that SolarWinds had incidentally installed. So one hack can have this huge effect in terms of cybersecurity on thousands of companies around the country, and that's certainly something to look out for. So that's the first type of risk. One other thing to mention too is that cybersecurity risk can be disproportionate and asymmetrical. You can be doing a very small amount of business with a vendor, but still face a great deal of risk depending on the level of access that they have. And it's also asymmetrical because the kind of risk that you face may not be related to the kind of work that they're doing. So for example, the CISO at Target probably wasn't thinking about refrigeration vendors as his most critical vector for a cybersecurity attack, but that's how that worked out. So when you're trying to control cybersecurity risk, you really have to think about the kind of access that they have more so than the type of business that you're doing with them. The next type of risk to talk through is third-party regulatory or compliance risk. This is the risk there's some kind of breach that happens or some kind of regulatory event that happens because of a third party's negligence or action. So I'm not a compliance expert or even a HIPAA expert, but I pulled up some statistics. There's what's maybe unfairly or lovingly called the HIPAA Wall of Shame, which is a website where your name goes up if you have some kind of HIPAA violation or some kind of HIPAA incident. So I pulled up some data off of that. The website refers to 3 different types of entities that can have HIPAA breaches. There's the service provider, meaning the doctor's office. There's the plan provider, which would be the insurance company. And then there's business associates, which are companies that do things like billing and technology and all kinds of stuff for the providers. So basically the other category. Business associates over the past 24 months have been responsible for about 2/3 of all HIPAA violations, and they've allowed about 24 million records to be breached. So quite a substantial size risk for many healthcare providers. A third-party HIPAA violation costs a provider an average of $900,000 when that happens. So I think that's why you see so many companies in healthcare have people who do professional risk management who are controlling that third-party risk. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, I pulled a few headlines for examples of companies that have gone through this. But like I say, there's hundreds of examples. It happens every month where there's some kind of HIPAA violation that happens from a third party. Next type of risk is financial. So financial risk is where the vendor might go through have some kind of financial trouble, and that impedes your business. So a couple of examples of that, GM faces catastrophic assembly disruption after a parts supplier goes bankrupt. This is back in 2016. I think most people are aware of this risk and control for it by doing credit checks on their vendors to make sure that they're, or looking through their financials to make sure that they're financially healthy enough and that they're not, creating some kind of risk by doing business with them. And then also there's the principle of not putting all your eggs in one basket, right? That's pretty effective too. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, there's a risk that I think a lot of us are going to be facing over the next even couple of days. There's a threat that railroad workers are going to strike. About 30% of the freight in the country goes over railroads. So I think all of us might be seeing higher prices in the grocery store because of it. And a number of companies will probably be struggling with supply chain issues because of this railroad strike. So I would call that a financial third-party risk. Let me grab a couple comments. Oh, it's Kathy. Okay, good. So that's financial risks. The next one to go through is operational risks. So operational risk is when a third party might prevent your business from delivering goods or services or taking care of your customers. If you ever want to read some truly painful business stories, then look up failed ERP implementations online. Hershey's had a terrible incident back in 1999 where they rushed an ERP implementation and ended up with about $100 million worth of orders unfilled, and a big drop in stock price and profits and all the rest of that. And that, obviously a pretty big problem for them. And then there's a great article that's linked up in this presentation, and if you want a copy of it, I'm happy to send it out. But it's from Harvard Business Review, and it talks through some examples of IT projects that go south. There's an example here around Levi Strauss that went through an IT project that didn't go so well. And I like this sentence that says, "But very quickly all hell broke loose," which is something that can happen with operational risk from third parties. Two more types of risks. So there's reputational risk, and a good example of that is what Apple went through with Foxconn. Foxconn is their manufacturing partner in China, and Foxconn has some troublesome employee personnel practices. And certainly a few years ago, they were having some big issues. The terrible phrase suicide nets came up. And there's some highlighted language up here about smells like garbage and lots of cockroaches and just some terrible conditions that they're working in. So I think we can say that Apple certainly faced some backlash and a risk event that was created by the partner in Foxconn. And that's something that needs to be taken care of too. Then the last example is strategic risk, and that's harder to define because it's any kind of risk that might limit your options or hamstring your company strategically. So I read a book, a biography of Dale Carnegie a few years ago, and I thought this was a great example of it, though it's not quite timely because it's back in the 19th century. But the way Andrew Carnegie got into the steel business was this: he had two friends. He was a successful business person. And then he had two friends who had a steel company, and there was some kind of dispute, some kind of argument they were going through. So they asked Andrew Carnegie if he could come in and settle the dispute for him. So Andrew came in and spent a few months wandering around the factory and learning everything he possibly could about the steel business. And at the end of the 2-3 months that he was consulting with them, he came back and said, "Well, this is what you do to solve it." And he settled the issue for him. And then like a month later, he opened up a steel mill next door. So that's it probably wasn't a risk that his two friends were thinking about when they asked him to get involved, but it was certainly a strategic risk of doing work with this effectively a consultant. So I think maybe a more modern example is if you do business with a consultant and then they take some of the things that they learn about your business and spread it to another and tell a competitor about that. I mean, that's an example of strategic risk, but there's certainly some creative ways that you can be harmed by a third party. So those are 6 different types of risk that we're going to try to control for. And I'm going to talk through third-party risk assessments next, and then also some of the tooling that goes into managing this. So I guess before I get into that, there's some vocabulary I wanted to establish that might be helpful. So a risk profile, that's the example of the likelihood and severity of any risk that's facing the company. There's a risk event, which is the undesirable event that affects the business. There's a risk appetite, which is the level of risk that the organization can accept. And not every company has the same risk appetite. If you're a utility, you probably have very low appetite for risk. If you're a technology company, you probably have a relatively high appetite for risk, but it's really going to be a board governance kind of decision. You have risk quantification, which is the process for measuring the risk against that likelihood and severity being the 2 big characteristics you're looking at. And then there's these last 3 terms that are kind of related to each other. There's inherent risk, which is the risk of just doing business with a vendor. Then there's risk mitigation, which are all the efforts that reduce that risk. And then the residual risk, which is the risk that you have remaining after you've done all the mitigation efforts. So yeah, I'll pause there for a second. So when I think through a third-party risk assessment, there's really 4 steps to understanding risk and then managing it. And this is actually a process that I developed or kind of co-developed with Linda Kostick, who's a PhD and a senior vice president over at Citi. And she helped me kind of put this together. So hopefully this makes sense for every type of organization, for everyone who's on the call. So of the 4 steps, the first one is to identify what inherent risks are associated with the engagement. So this is a brainstorming exercise where you're thinking through cybersecurity risk and regulatory compliance and financial. And there are a few good questions here that kind of summarize that. So for cybersecurity, what access is the vendor going to have? Right, that's the only question. It's not the size of the engagement or what they're working on, it's what access are they going to have to our systems. For regulatory or compliance, it's is any of the data that they have access to regulated? For financial, will our business be impacted by their finances in some way? So if they go out of business, are we impacted in a big way from that? For operational, can they limit our ability to earn revenue or take care of our clients? For reputational, can they make us look bad? And strategic, can they limit our options? So if you, and I've done this several times with clients, put those 6 questions up on a whiteboard and then kind of brainstorm all of the disasters that can happen. That at least creates better visibility for the risks and puts them all on the table so you can understand what you're trying to control for. So once you've listed out all of the risks that you have, the next step is to put them on an impact probability matrix to understand, what is an unacceptable level of risk, what's likely, and what would be highly impactful. So a few examples of this: there's a project delay risk. Every project could be delayed. And, frankly, after 20 years of working in IT, that's pretty likely. Most IT projects get delayed at some point and are delivered slightly behind the deadline. So that's a high probability event. But if we're honest, it's not that impactful. It's not going to really affect the quarterly numbers or that kind of thing. So that maybe it fits in that bottom right quadrant. If you have a security incident or a cybersecurity incident that happens, that's obviously much more impactful to the business, but hopefully it's been mitigated enough that it's probably pretty unlikely. Or if you have like an ERP, a failed ERP implementation, well, ERP implementations are really complex. They tend to get delayed and they tend to fail. There's a joke that they're called the CIO killer. So that's a relatively probable event. It's also an extremely impactful event depending on how it happens. If there's loss of data or loss of orders or that kind of thing, it can be a huge problem for people. So that's a big risk that would need to have some kind of mitigation applied to it. So step 1 is listing out all the risks that you're facing. Step 2 is rating those risks to understand where they fit in terms of impact and probability. Step 3 is going through mitigation efforts to control those risks. So mitigation efforts should really be driven by the supplier. They're probably providing the information to you because they're representing the risk to you. And there's a few different categories here. For cybersecurity, there are a number of services available, but you might ask for, there's a SIG, an SSAE, you might ask for things like SOC 2 Type 2 compliance or an ISO 27001 compliance, or you might have a questionnaire that you send out that has them outline what they're using for multi-factor authentication or any of the security tools that really need to be in place for that base level of security, right? So there's usually a big process around cybersecurity. If that fails, or the next level to protect you are the legal remedies. So your contract terms are going to be one way of mitigating or controlling the risk that you're facing. So the vendor should be responsible for any kind of damages that they create for the company because of some risks that they realized. And maybe you require your vendor to be insured as well. Probably a best practice there. And then finally, really the strongest arm here is the operational controls. So if you're trying to control for a project failure, for example, then having really good visibility into the status of the project is going to be a great way to control that. Also, a collaboration or a culture of risk management will be pretty important too. And this can be done formally through, bringing it up during quarterly business reviews and making sure there's a dedicated slide during every conversation with your vendor, or it can be done informally, just every time you're talking to them on the phone, bring it up and say, hey, by the way, what are the risks that we're facing here and how are you managing those risks? So just keeping that top of mind for all of the human beings who are working on the project. That's probably a best practice for controlling all the risks that you can. So you've identified the risks, you've rated the risks, you've mitigated the risks as well as you can. And the last thing to do is to understand what residual risk or what level of risk remains after going through this process, and then make sure that's lower than your risk appetite, right? And the question here is, after all of the mitigation efforts of working with this vendor, are they still too risky to do business with? And if they're not too busy to do business with, then you can move forward. And if they are, then you need to do more mitigation or think about a plan B. Now, some companies have dedicated risk managers, and they might have teams that are, working on this kind of thing. A lot of companies, especially SMB businesses, probably don't have people who are focused on risk. And for them, this might feel like a really onerous process that takes up a lot of time that they don't have. So I think there's a back of the napkin approach that applies for everybody. And actually probably applies for people in procurement who work at some of those larger companies, people who need to be thinking about risk and the third-party risk in particular. So I have a couple of questions here. I guess the recommendation is, before you walk into a meeting with one of your vendors, just walk through these 3 questions on a whiteboard or what have you. Think to yourself, what could go wrong with this engagement? So you're thinking through those 6 different categories of risk. Ask, are any of these events both probable and impactful, right? So you're kind of scoring that informally. And then you ask, how can we manage those risks, or the things that we can do internally that control the risk the third-party vendor is creating for us? And that's an exercise that, takes about 10 minutes to do, but, brings it front of mind for you, and also, maybe illuminates some of the bigger problems or bigger risks that you might be facing there. And then once you've worked through it, it's not a bad idea to have that conversation with the vendor to walk through the scoring and the risks that you foresee. But certainly put the onus of controlling these risks on the vendor. And there's these 2 sentences here. One of our objectives is to reduce risk with this engagement. Say this to the vendor. And then ask, how can you help us achieve this objective? And I've asked this of a number of vendors and have had some rather interesting responses. I had one vendor that was proposing a very sizable project, one of my clients, and I asked this question, and he came back very quickly and said, honestly, you guys have been so aggressive with pricing that we've had to cut project management back down substantially. And the result of it is that we think this project is pretty risky because we don't have people managing it. Like, oh, well, great. Like let's make sure you say that before we sign the agreement. But it's so asking this question was something that certainly lowered the level of risk and created better visibility for the client and for me. So I have been working on a little pet project too. I have an Excel template that's up on my website, and it's free. You're welcome to download it if you like. But it's called a back of the napkin risk assessment. And basically it's a simple Excel chart where you can fill in all the different types of risks, or the different risks that you're facing in each of those 6 different categories, and it'll automatically score them on that impact probability chart. And you can kind of get a sense of what risks are unacceptably impactful and unacceptably probable. I would love to see some feedback actually on how that's come together. So yeah, please do send it a link and download that if you can. And yeah, I think that's something that I might be developing and maturing. So that's kind of an informal tool. The next step is to go through some of the other more formal tools or the software packages that you can purchase that help you control these third-party risks. And I know I'm going pretty quickly through all these slides. I guess please feel free to put questions in the chat or interrupt me. I would welcome all of that because that kind of breaks up the presentation. Okay, so for risk management tool set, there's a lot of overlapping systems and some nomenclature here. So I just wanted to throw this on the table. I spent a lot of time looking through these systems, and honestly, no 2 system does the exact same thing. And no 2 systems refer to themselves the exact same way. So you obviously have things like GRC, or governance risk compliance systems. You have risk management systems, IT risk management systems, third-party risk management, contract lifecycle management, and vendor management systems. And all of these things do slightly different things, and none of them really follow this, set of capabilities, right? So it's quite confusing actually as you start to dive into this and understand what systems are out there. And it's pretty easy to buy something that doesn't exactly do what you need or does more than what you need. So there's really 4 different things that can derail an implementation of a system like this. The first one is weak business case. If there aren't people in your company who are dependent on this going well in order to get their bonuses at the end of the year, then either the bonus structure is wrong, or maybe this isn't as big a priority as you might think. So, making sure the business case behind adopting these systems is pretty critical. The next one is functional mismatch or overbuilding. Some of these systems do absolutely everything, and that might not be appropriate for you. It could be an Excel spreadsheet is sufficient. So making sure you understand what functionality or capabilities are required before moving into the engagement is pretty critical. And then finally, inaccurate data or bypassing the system. If the data is bad in the system, people won't use it, and it just snowballs into a terrible situation where you're paying for a system that really isn't the single source of truth. So, I think the recommendation here is to do a lot of work in terms of understanding requirements before actually engaging with the vendors. So this is an example of the strategic sourcing process that I use based on the TOGAF enterprise architecture model. So, start with understanding the business architecture, which includes things like functional decomposition, value stream mapping, and strategy mapping against capabilities, and really understand what you're trying to achieve as a function, right? And then from there, you can derive all the business requirements for the system. So you're identifying scope and stakeholders and business objectives, et cetera. And then after you've really, set the groundwork for what you're trying to accomplish, that's when you start to engage with vendors to understand what their systems are capable of doing and how that fits into your vision for the model. So I guess the recommendation is before you start working with any of these systems, spend a lot of time thinking about how the system is actually going to be used within the business. But assuming all that's been completed, there are quite a number of systems to look at. And I'll walk through, I think, 4 of these that might be relevant. So I took the Gardner report and the Forrester report and read through it. And then I compared, which vendors are being considered by both. And this kind of lets you know which ones are the market leaders. So OneTrust, ServiceNow, MetricStream, and Diligent are great examples. Arch is a great example too. I like what Prevalent has to do, although I don't really feature it in this slide deck. Workiva as well, but there's some great options out there that do exactly this or do things that are similar to it. And I'll walk through a couple examples of that now. So the first one to talk through is Diligent. Diligent is the market leader for GRC in terms of market share, the most revenue coming back. They've done 16 acquisitions over the past 20 years or so, including a company called Galvanize that has a presence here in Denver. But really, Diligent is a board level perspective that has a TPRM or a third party risk management module with it, right? So it's Diligence really a platform for helping the board interact with the management of a company. And obviously the board's going to be interested in risk. So TPRM kind of fits within that sphere or that purview. So if you're thinking primarily about risk from a board perspective, the Diligent might be a great place to start. I have a joke here. The YouTube video has an English accent. I don't know why it is, but SaaS providers always use people with English accents on their demo videos. It's very strange. They're based in New York, but it's a pleasant English accent. And then they have some interesting corporate behavior too. You might just look on Wikipedia about Diligent before you do business with them. Just as a GRC company, you would expect some different kinds of things, but just take a look at it. Next option is OneTrust. OneTrust was the fastest growing private company in the country a couple of years ago, and they're still in the Inc. 500. It's a platform that does sustainability, third-party risk management, and data privacy work, so quite a bit of scope to it. I think looking through it, it's really very strong on all the compliance side of it, right? So if you have high compliance requirements, you're trying to do SOC 2 or HIPAA or one of those kinds of things, then they have a lot of the questions pre-populated for all those different compliance sides. So if that's the primary purpose for the risk management, then that might be a place to start. Then they also have some strength around things like carbon accounting and some of the ESG programs too. So I know that the values-based business is obviously a pretty good trend, an important trend. So if that describes your business, if your business is trying to be ethical, then OneTrust might be something to consider too. Archer is a good option as well. Archer has quite a number of visualizations put together. It's a system that's really more workflow based. It's a system you would want to work in, but it's maybe weaker on some of the reporting side in terms of visibility for the board level. But if you're looking for risk quantification things and understanding more than just impact and probability, They have some great tools built into that, and it's really worth a demo to look through that too. Vendor portal is important as well. If you're looking for the vendor to start entering information, and so you're not actually doing all the manual work of gathering it, that's pretty impressive as well. The next one is Tentacle. Tentacle is a cybersecurity focused business. So they do third-party assessments in terms of cybersecurity, and I've been working with the team a little bit over there, and I've been impressed with it's a values-based organization, and it's an organization that really understands all of the cybersecurity standards and frameworks that have to be met. So if that's the primary thrust of the initiative, then I think Tentacle might be a great option to look through. And then finally, BitSight is also a vendor risk management platform focused on cybersecurity, a pretty mature program. It's not just a software program, it's also a service. So if you have a vendor that you need approved for cybersecurity, then you can send it over to them, and they'll have a service that will approve them or work with the vendor to work through that. So a few different options for managing risk in terms of platforms. I want to walk through the end of the presentation. So yeah, let's open it up for questions, and happy to talk through any of the information I covered.
Okay, if you could just put some any comments or questions in the chat for Stephen. Maybe you can even mention some of your challenges that you're going through with your vendor risk management.
That'd be great.
Thanks, Stephen, for this presentation. It was very insightful. And I was just wondering, I did see something this morning about I think it was the Iranians cyber attack.
Yes, yeah. The news for cyber attacks comes up pretty regularly. There's quite a list of them. That's yeah. One good idea, I guess, is to make sure that you're talking about all those cyber attacks that hit the news, hit the media with your vendors too, because it's a way of kind of keeping things top of mind, and then also making sure that the specific threat that gets surfaced is being addressed. So I kind of recommend that.
Yeah, are there any other ones out there that you think we should keep an eye on?
I'm working on a presentation for next week around MSSPs, and I've been researching some of the bad actors that are working into it, and it's quite chilling what's going on. There's 5 main players in the ransomware world. It's they paid about $1 billion. About $1 billion in ransoms were paid last year. So it's big business, right? This isn't a small thing. It's nobody in their basement working on it. Many of these groups are sponsored or state sponsored. So they have the Russian government or the Chinese government working behind them. And it's kind of the Wild West out there. So that's been some interesting research to get through.
Oh, wow. We did get a question in. What tools do you recommend for evaluating financial risk?
Yeah, there's a number of services that do things like credit checks that help make sure the vendor has the financials to be able to do business with them. And then I think there's also this process of making sure you're not putting all your eggs in one basket. So especially if you're working with newer vendors or smaller vendors that might not have the financial depth or the deep pockets you need to get out of trouble, then you'll be cautious about that. I know that there are services out there that do all the financial checks for you. I just haven't worked directly with that. My world is more on the cybersecurity side. That's my focus, really. Hopefully that helps, though. Yeah.
I have a question for you too. With so many people still working from home remote, do you have any suggestions for them to make sure that they're doing what they should be doing securely?
Yeah, there's a set of questions that need to be asked of companies that have remote workers, because home networks are typically not very well secured, and that can be a point of entry for a bad actor. So the SIG, the standard, there's an information gathering, standard information gathering form. If you look up SIG online, you can see it. There's a whole list of questions that need to go into that to make sure that they have, they're not letting their kids use the computer for playing games afterwards or downloading mods to Minecraft or that kind of stuff. You might ask too about the network and how they connect. Yeah, there's a bunch of cybersecurity things that need to be addressed there.
Wow, thank you. Just saying it's a great session. Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. Any final comments before we close out?
Well, hopefully that is helpful. I really appreciate the opportunity to present and talk through this with everyone. If you can make it to the managed security service provider session that I'm doing next week, I'm kind of excited for that one. I've been working on that deck for a while. And also let me know if you'd like access to the template or any of the slide deck. I'm happy to send out a copy of that so that you guys have all the links that I put into it.
Yes, if you could send me the slide deck, I'll make sure everybody gets a copy of the slides from today's program.
Yeah, happy to.
Oh, that would be great. That would be great. Well, at this point, I'm going to close out the program. We're a little bit early today, but we didn't have as many questions as we thought we would have. But I would like to thank you, Stephen. I'd like to thank all of our attendees for joining us today. I will be doing a post email. In that email, you're going to get a copy of the recording for today. So that way, if you'd like to share it with any of your colleagues out there, we say please do. Also, you're going to get continuing educational hour for participating today. And then you'll also get the slide deck as well. And I'll give you Stephen's contact information in case you would like to reach out to him as well, especially if you have any security issues or if you just need to talk to Stephen and get some advice from him. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Glad you were able to join us. And don't forget, tune in to Stephen's program on the 21st with ISM Dallas. And also our membership meeting will be the following day on September 22nd. So thank you all for joining us and have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.